Good morning, everyone. I am Abigail Moberg, like Clay Jenkinson said. I am a freshman student at GSU. I am in the TR Honor Program, and I'm honored to be with you this morning to introduce today's first speaker. The first speaker today is Char Miller. Char Miller is the W.M. Keck Professor of Environmental Analysis at Pomona College in Claremont, California. In 2013, Mr. Miller was titled the Whig Distinguished Professor at Pomona College in recognition of his excellence in teaching. In 2015, he received the Alumni Office's Distinguished Service Award. Mr. Miller also serves as the Senior Fellow of the Pinchot Institute for Conservation and a Fellow of the Forest History Society. He has authored many books and frequently contributes his essays, commentary, and reviews to newspapers, journals, and online venues. Some of his many areas of expertise include U.S. intellectual and cultural history, U.S. environmental policy, and U.S. public lands management. Here to talk to us today about Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, please help me in welcoming Mr. Char Miller.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. Thank you all very, very much, and I want to thank you for the rain. I live in Southern California, and I called my wife last night, and I said, there's something falling from the sky. They tell me it's rain, so this is great. And I'm thrilled to be here, in part because this symposium for the last 12 years has been one of those nuclei of intellectual interchange and dialogue and debate that I have been so envious of my peers that they have had the chance to participate. So I'm grateful to Clay and to Sharon and to others for making this possible. What I want to do today is to sort of in part pick up on where Darren ended off. Darren spent a great deal of time talking about, and brilliantly so, the way in which science as a methodology and science as a way of framing one's life shaped what Theodore Roosevelt did and how he thought about the world in which he immersed himself. I want to flip the story in a sense because that's a very public face. And talk in part about a very personal space that he also occupied. The people who gravitated around him, who worked with him, who worked for him, but also worked with him. A partnership in particular with Gifford Pinchot, who would be the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, actually got into federal service before Roosevelt arrived in D.C., but they were friends before that point. And the point of this, in effect, is to at once talk about the impact that these two men had, but always to know that that impact would not have been as deep and as lasting as it was without their relationship, a personal relationship, so that in effect we get to go inside the White House to see how these guys operated in private with one another, how they played together, how they fought together, how they wrestled and all these other things, but also in the process of doing that are making policy. And we tend to forget that, at least those of us who think about policy tend to forget. There's actually people who make this stuff. And there's reasons why they do that, which may have nothing to do with the policy. They just like each other. And so part of what I want to do is to keep that affective, emotional realm alive as best as possible, to sort of reconstruct it at some level. And to do that, thinking about this photograph from 1907 doesn't really get you there, but it does tell you something about the intimacy of these two men at a quiet moment at a conference, motoring down the Ohio-Mississippi River, thinking about the way in which they actually crafted much of what they did. But I want to start here. Because for those of you who have read Theodore Roosevelt's autobiography, and it's a great read, you can't say that about all autobiographies, but this one you can. In there is a chapter about Roosevelt's work in conservation during his presidency. And in that chapter, which Gifford Pinchot wrote at least a good portion of it, leaving himself out of the story, there is commentary in there about Gifford Pinchot and the ways in which, in this particular cartoon suggests, pulling some of the language out, that chief among Roosevelt's supporters, advocates, promoters, and sort of intellectual engines was Gifford Pinchot. He was the first among equals as far as Teddy Roosevelt was concerned within his White House. And keep in mind, he's only an agency chief. He's not the vice president. He's not a cabinet officer. He has He's below cabinet officer. So really, if you're thinking about the relationship between the White House and the executive branch, Pinchot is 2 notches down. But he had such a close relationship with Roosevelt that not only can we get a cartoon like this, which is also intimate, a man's arm draped around another man's shoulder with sort of his words attached here, talking about the powerful relationship these two men developed over time. These are words that would have made any mother proud, and in fact, they made Gifford's mother proud for 2 reasons. The first of which was she believed them to be true. And the second reason is that she forced Roosevelt to put them in his autobiography. She was a very powerful woman, Mary Eno Pinchot. She was richer than any Roosevelt. She was more engaged politically than most of them. Her family had politicians up and down their genealogy. Gifford was raised in a household in which he lived in the Fifth Avenue Hotel that his grandfather built on Broadway, and on 20th and Broadway, exactly where TR finds the seal. Amos Eno, which is Gifford's grandfather, one of the great real estate speculators in New York history. There's another, at least one. Okay, just, I know it's Friday morning. Caffeine may not have kicked in yet. But Amos Eno invented Broadway. Streets don't just happen. Somebody creates them. And Amos Eno looked at this undeveloped stretch of Manhattan and said, cool place for buildings. And it goes from 16th to 18th Street forward up to about 35th Street and starts dropping down things like the Flatiron Building, which is his, Fifth Avenue Hotel, and a series of others, and basically invents what we call the Great White Way. So it's not like Gifford grew up poor and scrabbling. And his mother is well aware of what her son did for Theodore Roosevelt. So when one night in 1913, Gifford comes home to read to his mother the draft of the chapter that Theodore Roosevelt was going to put into his autobiography. It was a companionable moment. They're sitting and Gifford is reading out loud, and his mother, who is not on her deathbed, but she would be dead within the year, is listening. And she got perturbed, is the nice way to put it, because there was no mention of her son. They talked about why he wasn't in there. Gifford sort of did the manly reticence thing. Well, people know, and I don't need to be named. But I know their relationship. He's cueing his mother that he actually is a little upset and he would like her to do something. Okay, so he's in his 40s, but still Mom was a real powerful figure in his life. She goes over to her writing desk and writes a letter, "My dear Colonel," in which he just diminished him. She should have said, "Mr. President." She just demoted him. And then she lit into him and said, all that my son has done for you, all that administration achieved, didn't simply depend upon my son, but as you yourself know, the work that he did was paramount to the success of your administration. And I'm appalled that you didn't say so. She also put it in ways that I know she knew Roosevelt well enough to say this. This is not really about my son. It's about the history of your administration. And if you want history to remember your administration's strengths, then you've got to put Gifford in here because that's how he will elevate you. She was deft. Really sharp. And so that happened. He put it in. She wrote him a very courteous letter afterwards, thanking him for recognizing her son. Case closed. But when we read the book, it's just there. The backstory is much more interesting and tells us about this dynamic, these personal dynamics that happened that we wouldn't know if they didn't write letters and keep diaries, so that we could sort of reconstruct the lived experience of these human beings, whether they're great or small, so whatever they do. I mean, there are things in the background that we don't know much about. But we also know, because both men wrote about this greatly, that before this moment, They had a really interesting set of relationships. Let me go back one slide here. And it happened one day in 1899. It's not the first time Gifford and Roosevelt had met one another, but it is memorable because both men wrote about it in both biographies and in letters. Teddy was governor of New York. Gifford Pinchot was in his first year as the head of the Bureau of Forestry, a tiny organization inside the Department of Agriculture with 4 people on staff and not a single acre under its management. All of the public lands in the United States were the Department of Interior, and Pinchot's in agriculture. So he's on his way up to Mount Marcy, where in another year or so, 2 years or so, Roosevelt will be picnicking when he learns that McKinley's the assassin's bullet has basically taken his president's life, and he's about to become president. Pinchot is going to climb Mount Marcy, not in the summertime for spring, because like Roosevelt, he believed in the strenuous life. He's going to go up in the winter. I'll show you a slide in a second that helps you understand how stupid this was. Or let's say less smart than it might have been. But as Pinchot walks up this drive to come visit his friend Theodore Roosevelt, the governor of New York, you might think the governor is out doing work, the legislative work of his job, but no. He and his children are playing a game in which they are being attacked. The castle is being attacked. And to help his children escape, Roosevelt has dropped a rope from the tallest room in that building, and his kids are climbing down as Gifford is walking up. Like, what kind of parent is this? He's a crazy man. But that's the kind of thing that, in fact, Roosevelt did, and that night, as they talked policy and sort of thought through their relationship as it was unfolding, because they were both highly competitive men, they decided that they would box and wrestle. Gifford is 6'1", 6'2", so you know how the boxing part went. He dropped Roosevelt to the floor because he had a long reach, and there was no way the very stocky, if that's fair to say, Mr. President, soon to be, could have gotten under those long arms, at which point Teddy said, "Let's wrestle." Because lanky Gifford, who probably weighed, 150 pounds at 6'2", he was literally a string bean in many ways, didn't stand a chance and got pinned. But in their embrace, literal and figurative, is what I think is how they forged their partnership. And at the end of Roosevelt's presidency, in a private letter to Pinchot, thanking him for his work that does not appear in the autobiography, he said, "We worked together really well in large part because we played together." That they understood that recreation, if you take the word apart, recreation, was exactly what they were doing. In the governor's mansion, in the White House, was literally sort of physically recreating themselves, a recreational process that also has political consequences. They could think almost alike because, in fact, they fought, they boxed, they hunted, they took long hikes, they did all these kinds of things. And in a way, you can see also the fear of missing out that Roosevelt always had. Because this is Pinchot one day later, before he's about to summit Mount Marcy, camping in the snow. The next day, they go up that mountain in the worst blizzard New York has ever had. It's 50 below on the top of that mountain. The winds are howling at some God knows what kind of speed. Pinchot describes literally crawling on his hands, because why wouldn't you want to go to the summit when it's 50 below? Literally clawing his way through there to stand on the top of this mountain. One of his companions got frostbite. Well, what a shock. The next day, he basically slides down this mountain, gets to Albany, and Roosevelt is so jealous that he was not up there with him. But that also tells you something about these guys, at once competitive nature, but also thrill at the other's success. And that's a rare kind of relationship that allows you to have at once that in which you'd really like to outdo this guy, but you love the fact when they succeed. If success is climbing a mountain at 50 degrees below zero and getting frostbite, that's a narrow framing of success, I think. But I think it also is part of the ways in which we think about Roosevelt and Pinchot in Washington. As I said, Gifford Pinchot became the fourth head of the Bureau of Forestry in 1898. Roosevelt would become president after McKinley's assassination 2 years later. And it's at that moment you can start to see the way in which conservation as a political concept and as a movement starts to take off really, really fast. But before we do that part of the political history, I want to take us into places like Rock Creek Park, which we're going to hear about later today also, I think. Because Roosevelt and Pinchot and all sorts of people would take these hikes through Rock Creek Park. They would swim in the Potomac, and the preferred way of swimming for Roosevelt and Pinchot was au naturel. So they'd get to the Potomac, strip down, and go swimming in the Potomac, the President of the United States, do keep in mind. And there is an episode, I don't know if it's true, but I like it, so you're going to hear it, and you're going to love it, and that's all you'll remember, in which they're on one of these forced marches, one might imagine them to have been. They get to the Potomac, and the ambassador of France is with them, who is a close friend of Roosevelt's also, who strips down, just as does his American peers, but he left on his kid gloves. And Roosevelt sort of looks at him like, dude, they gotta go. And the French ambassador holds up his hands and he said, I'm only wearing this in case we meet the ladies. Like, is this a fig leaf? What is this? I don't know. It's your hands, man. But that's part of it. The other piece of this is that Pinchot started to get a little worried that they were doing this all the time. They were on horseback, they were hiking, they were doing all this stuff, and Roosevelt wanted no Secret Service, wanted no armed guard. Pinchot figured this is probably not the right thing to do given that his predecessor got shot, that other presidents had already been assassinated. Maybe we ought to think this one through. So at this point, Pinchot started packing a pistol, surreptitiously, but just in case some madman figured out that these guys were also madmen and they were roaming around the countryside when they should have been governing, but they were doing other kinds of things. So there is this kind of, at once, protectiveness that unfolded also in this relationship. Pinchot recognizing that that guy's the president, I'm a subordinate, and so I have some obligation to sort of make sure he remains president for as long as he wishes to be. And I think that becomes part of the central dynamic that they then capture and push towards a political reality that today amounts to, within the Forest Service, 193 million acres of forest, wilderness, and grasslands. But we didn't have that then entirely. And I want to tell the backstory politically, and I want to tell it through imagery that the Forest Service utilized as a way to express why it existed at all. The agency would be founded in 1905. It would be founded in part because Pinchot early on recognized, or at least argued, that although he had an agency and had a tiny budget and no staff, and all of the public lands were in a different cabinet office in the Department of Interior, there were options. He could have picked up his staff, walked across the street, and dropped himself into Interior, and the U.S. Forest Service today would be in the Department of Interior. That would have been too easy. Again, keep in mind, these guys don't do easy things. Instead, the real challenge was to figure out how to move 150 million acres out of Department of Interior, away from one cabinet office, imagine that, and into another cabinet office in Department of Agriculture. And he's not going to be able to do it unless he had a president who thought that was a really, really good idea also. And in 1898, he didn't have a president who thought that was a really, really good idea. So he plots and he works and he negotiates and he argues for 7 years before that event unfolded. But the way the argument culturally plays out, as opposed to politically, is the way in which we need to be thinking the way they thought so we can understand why they made the decisions that they made. So I want to use 3 slides that articulate what conservationists thought was true in the first part of the 20th century, and that becomes the basis for much of the claims that they would make subsequent to that point. So 1620, the area of virgin forest. Forests, in fact, were not virgin in the United States, whatever that might mean. They had been managed deeply by native peoples in a lot of different spaces in a lot of different ways, but they don't know that or are unwilling to sort of acknowledge that. This is what they thought it was. So think about a squirrel in northern Maine. What could that really smart squirrel do? Should it have the traveling urge? That's not a rhetorical question. Where can it go? Assuming this canopy, this blackness is accurate. Texas. Why not? It's a great state. So you could really move, presumably, from one forest cover to another forest cover, never touching the ground. Again, not true, but this is what they understood to have been true. 1850. What's happened? If only partially. Some deforestation is beginning to occur. Where is it beginning to occur? Look at those white areas that are emerging. Tell me what's happening there in addition to trees coming down. Why in those places and not in other places? Industrialization, but by 1850, we're not much of an industrial power. Agriculture, right. So think about rivers and the rivers in the east, if you know the sort of geography of the East Coast. And I'll give you a perfect example of what's going on. This is really, can you see the red line here? Okay. At the corner of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York is where Gifford Pinchot's family lived. It's where his grandfather and great-grandfather made much of their money logging. And you can see by what they had done by the 1850s. They had basically logged out that corner of northeastern Pennsylvania. Well, what did they do with the logs? You float them down the Delaware River, and you literally ride log rafts downstream, and at every river port you stop and ask, do you need wood? And sort of the raft is getting smaller and smaller as you go down until you get to Philadelphia, through which Delaware runs, and that's where you almost always sold most of the wood anyway. But go on any river, slow-moving river in the United States, and that's how they got wood out up through the Civil War. There aren't roads, there aren't railroads, there's no other way to do it, and there's no other cheaper way to get logs there. But it just meant that wherever your market was, it better be on a river. Because if you wanted to go east-west, but the river ran north-south, that's where you went. So the economic geography of this is you're constrained by how you move objects out of the forest and into the economy. But still, they did a pretty good job. And the other indicator is, where did most people live in the United States in 1850? Exactly there. So it's also about the dynamics of population growth and change and the need for agriculture. And so you take out trees to have farming, but you take out trees to go into the economy to build houses and wharves and bridges and everything else. As one English visitor to this country said about the United States, this is a wooden country. And he was not talking about the forest, he was talking about every single tool, every object in American households, including the households, including what were called corduroy roads and things like that. They're all made out of wood because it's everywhere. And you have access to it. So that's 1850. That's 1920. Ooh, I heard a noise. What happened between 1850 and 1920? Now give it to me.
Industrialization.
Industrialization is one of three central forces post-Civil War that transformed the landscape. It transformed everything else. But industrialization needs what to be successful? People. Where are people coming from between 1850 and 1920? Europe. Massive waves of immigration, upwards of 1 million people a year, are pouring into those major cities. Some of them are coming out to the Dakotas. The vast majority of them stick in central urban centers. So you not only have industrialization and immigration, you have extraordinarily large cities blowing up in size. New York went from 1 million to 5 million in this period. Well, how much wood must they have for fuel? How much wood do railroads need for railroad ties when we're launching across the West? They're basically cutting down trees, turning them into railroad ties, and within a year, those railroad ties, because it's green wood, are bending up, so you have to go back behind it and redo it again. They're using upwards of 1 billion board feet of timber by the 1890s simply to keep railroads functioning. If you want to dig out coal, what do you do with mine shafts? Line them with wood. Everything consumed wood in this industrializing economy. And plus they have new saws that are steam powered that you could ride on rails and move around. Wherever the rails went, you could take out timber. So in 70 years, you could take out many more trees over a vast stretch of land than you could have done in the preceding 250. That's what the Industrial Revolution did. Now, come back to the point that Roosevelt and Pinchot and their generation of conservationists, and in fact the generation prior to them, are growing up in that environment in which the trees are moving by them very, very rapidly. The habitat that they once hunted in is disappearing quickly. All of these things come conjoined in the latter part of the 19th century and are framed in ways that other photographs that the Forest Service would take, looking at harvest clear cuts in Michigan in 1850. This photograph is taken 60 years later. Two things didn't happen. Trees don't grow back, and if the logic is you take down trees and then you farm, soil is depleted. There are no furrows here. It's Michigan. It was made to grow trees, not corn. But the calculation is everything is about agriculture, so let's strip it away, and then we'll realize we made a mistake afterwards. Or this one from 1915 in Colorado. Again, your eyes probably focus on two things: stumps and the erosion. It's going to be really hard to regenerate this forest. Not only have you lost its cover and its seed trees that might allow you to reseed this space, you're losing the soil quickly. And essentially the argument that what would become the Forest Service will make, what conservationists have been making since the 1860s, you can't do this and survive. You can do it for a generation, but subsequent to that, it's game over. Because if you don't somehow figure out how to slow this process down or regenerate fast enough that you can regenerate and re-energize the economy, you've just ruined your grandchildren's futures. And as we learned last night, that was one of the things that Roosevelt and his peers talked about all of the time. What is it 70 years out that's going to last way beyond us in terms of our relationships to the world? They picked up on Roosevelt, Pinchot, and their generation. The words of this guy, George Perkins Marsh. His book, Man and Nature, Earth as Modified by Human Action, appeared in 1864, the year before Gifford was born, and Teddy was 9. This is the book they all read. It was the book that gave all of them the language they would use, and frankly, it's the language, even though none of us in this room, probably except a few of us, have read any portion of it. It's 600 pages. It's a little long. It's a little dense. It's 19th century prose. Nonetheless, we still use the language, even though we don't know the source of it. And Marsh makes two arguments. Arguments that he learned as a child in Vermont, arguments that he learned as a diplomat for the United States in Italy and the Mediterranean basin during the Civil War. The first of which is that other empires, other ambitious, powerful nations like the United States in the past have cut through their natural resources, overgrazed, burned up, chewed down, whatever it might be. Whatever the resources Greece had were gone, and Greece is not Greece as it once was. Whatever Egypt had for natural resources are gone, and so cool pyramids, but nothing much beyond that. Marsh lived in Rome, absolutely loved Rome. Who doesn't? Loved walking around and looking at the Roman ruins, but they were ruins. Where were those Romans? What happened to them? And Earth is modified by human action isn't just about the modification, it's the way in which that modification actually destroys empires and powerful nations that don't take don't pay attention to their natural resources or their consumption of it. As I say, I don't know that it was a bestseller, but people talked about it a lot, which is what, as Mark Twain says about classic books, is how you know it's a classic book. Everybody talks about it. Nobody's read it. Well, one of the people who did read it is George Bird Grinnell, about whom we also heard last night. And a remarkable figure who's involved in the creation of Glacier National Park, involved in the sort of identification of Yellowstone to be a national park, who founded the Boone and Crockett Club, whose Forest and Stream magazine was the central text by which Grinnell took Marsh's book and injected it into the popular discussion, creating coalitions of hunters and anglers around the United States who now will not read Marsh because they don't have to. They just have to read the translator, who is George Bird Grinnell, who's thinking through these dilemmas as a policy person. Marsh is at the 30,000 feet, and it's Grinnell who is sort of like the lifeline that drops down from 30,000 feet. It says, okay, how do we take these abstract principles that aren't that abstract? We can see them on the ground. And how do we take and talk to Americans, as Marsh did at the close of his book, which is to say, if we want to be like Greece, we're well on our way. If we don't want to be that, and he also said, the British are almost about to do the same thing, so we don't want to follow them either. If we want to be different, we must be stewards. His language. And Grinnell says, okay, so how do we become stewards? And who's going to do the stewardship? And how is that going to be framed? We learned last night about the way in which sort of museum pursuits, the pursuit of scientific knowledge through collection, was one of the mechanisms by which you did this. Grinnell, who was also a hunter-gatherer in his way, deeply involved in these issues, recognized that there has to be a political response also. How do you get a political response in a democracy? You build coalitions. And through Forest and Stream, he will write editorial after editorial after editorial, sort of taking Marsh and thinking about the political implications of his ideas. And I want to quote from one of his editorials in 1883. Again, Pinchot is 18 at this point. Roosevelt may be 9 years older than that. They're nowhere near in office yet. They haven't done anything in the public realm yet. And in an essay that he calls Forest Reservations, Grinnell says the following at the close of this editorial. No woods, no game. No woods, no water. No water, no fish. No woods, no game. No woods, no water. No water, no fish. What's at the base of his argument? What's the defining feature ecologically? Food chain, habitat. Take out woods, and everything else falls apart. It's the keystone species. That's why we need forest reserves in 1883. We don't get them for another 8 years. But it's Grinnell who's basically building the ideas that will then flash out across these very small local grassroots organizations who start to argue with their local representatives that, I just read Grinnell, this seems to me really crucial, and we need to be talking about it. Let me give you a quick example. Long before, again, Roosevelt gets into office, long before Pinchot gets into office, the citizens of Los Angeles recognized not only in Grinnell, but in their own lived experience, that their water came from the San Gabriel Mountains, which lie to their north and scrape Pacific storms of their rain, that drops into the alluvial fan, that percolates into the aquifers on which, in fact, my house sits today. My community in Southern California gets 70% of its water from the water at our feet. And I know exactly where it comes from because I know what watershed I lived in, and so did they in the 1880s. And in the 1880s, they are arguing with their congressional representatives that we need some mechanism by which to save those mountains. Not because it has timber, because it's chaparral, but it does the same thing. Again, long before Roosevelt, long before Pinchot, people on the ground are making these connections. So that when in 1891, the Forest Reserve Act is passed, and the next three presidents, I'm going to mess this up, Harrison, Cleveland, and McKinley, start designating the first forest reserves. The folks in LA basically had the model already. They basically walked to their representative and said, do it. And it was the second forest reserve. The Angeles National Forest today is the second oldest forest reserve in the United States, in 1891. Again, Roosevelt's not in office, Pinchot's not in office. 45 million acres were set aside on the principle that these forest reserves would manage the flow of water first and timber second, because they recognized that the world that they could create now with this legislation was crucial, and they recognized, a la Marsh, that if you don't read the big 600 pages and you don't read Grinnell, surely you will read a cartoon, which is all Marsh. This is what Uncle Sam will look like in 20 years, devoid of hair. For those of us follically challenged, it's an interesting cartoon because it actually references whom? Who lost his hair and lost his power? Samson. And everybody reading that cartoon in 1908 knew that. That's Marsh in, what, less than 10 words. Now you really don't have to read the book, because that's the argument. Chew out your natural resources, and like Samson, you could become impotent. And this is the United States that had just become an empire. My God, they're already anxious about losing, I don't know, Puerto Rico. So they understood the calculations that were rolling through the community and in a political sense, and this becomes, this building, this ugly building on the top floor, on its 8th floor, becomes the epicenter in which all of these ideas will start to emerge in a much more coordinated, calculated, and cooperative manner between the executive branch on the one hand, the White House on the other, and Congress on the third. That's where the Forest Service would be located, in Garrett. That tells you how much anybody cared about them. They're up there in the attic, heat rises, the summer must have been awful in that space, which is why Gifford Pinchot did something really interesting. Every summer, he closed the office and sent everybody in the office out west. How are we going to know what's happening out here unless we're out here? Besides, who wants to stay in Washington in that tropical, humid sweat box? I mean, it was calculated, personal, and very savvy about what happens, but in that building is where the conversations start to emerge that will create what we call the Forest Service, what will create what we call now today the National Forests, and in which Pinchot and Roosevelt and others begin to remap the United States. On the left-hand side are the national forests that existed in 1898, the 45 million acres. We heard last night it was 230 million, and it went from 0 to 230. It actually did not. It went from 45 onwards. Roosevelt is the 4th president to add to this inventory. But note the difference between 98 and 07. You can see the sort of pushing out of this process, the redesignation of public lands into national forests. Keep in mind, this was always federal land. It was never purchased. It was never taken. There was no eminent domain. These are just a rewriting of the rules and regulations about how these lands were managed. But I want you to look at both maps and tell me what they went after. Geographically, what did they capture? Mountains. Every single mountain range in the American West, virtually, has some form of federal land management on top of it. And in this case, particularly in the West, you can see, and I've happily put some cities on there so you can sort of capture what's going on. Every one of them gets their water from a national forest. In the West, it's up to 30 to 40% of all water flows off of a national forest and into some urban center. And they don't know Phoenix is going to become 6 million. They don't know that greater Los Angeles would be upwards of 20 million people, but they did know however many people lived in those spaces, they were going to require water. These mountain sheds were the source of that water, whether it's Tucson or Phoenix, Denver, which cheats because it's got 4 bores through the Rocky Mountains to pull water from the west side to the east side, so they get not only the water that sheets off on the east side of the Rockies, off of national forests, they take it from other people. Los Angeles didn't invent the stealing of water from other people. Every city does that. But they knew what they were doing in the 1890s. Again, Roosevelt is not in office. Pinchot has barely gotten into office when this stuff starts to unfold. So there's an earlier generation to whom we need to give thanks and to whom Pinchot routinely did, because he fully appreciated that he required other people to have done work for him to do the work that he and Roosevelt would do. But not everybody appreciated it. They were pretty sure they were doing God's work, but it turns out other people thought they were the devil. That's why you have Manichaean struggles between good and evil, and so there were those who will see them as evil, and I want to give you a series of political cartoons that are the pushback. This one here suggests that the U.S. forest reserves, as they were laid down, become not spaces in which you can regulate the management of these landscapes, but in fact they become barriers to any kind of economic activity. You would get the counter, this sort of daft-looking Teddy Roosevelt articulating why we needed to protect these preserves, but most of the time there were other things at play here. So I want to give you 2 cartoons in particular, 3. And it's hard to read them, and I grant that for those of you in the back. That's Gifford on the horse. That's James Garfield, who's the Department of Interior Secretary under Roosevelt, and there's Teddy in the background. Tell me how they're dressed and what their dress tells us about how the West thought of these men. At least the 2 in the foreground. Dandies. Look at Gifford's sort of Panama hat, straw hat, flying off of his head. By the way, he never wore such a thing. James Garfield. What's he trying to do with that rope? Rein in the horse, and who's the horse in this image? The West. So the East is coming to try to restrain the West, and Teddy, in that buckskin suit, which we heard so much about, is dressed appropriately and says something, great catamounts, I doubt I ought to have done this work myself. Okay. Presidents don't do this kind of work themselves. That's why you have agency heads. That's their job, is to go out and be pilloried, as Pinchot is here, although I do love this cartoon from Colorado. Look carefully at what Colorado looks like. So you're laughing, so come on. It looks like Teddy. So tell me what the cartoonist has in mind, putting Teddy's face, his impress, into the state. What's the objection? Outside interference. But it's the president's face. What's the underlying argument that's taking place that Colorado objects to? Executive power. He did name it the White House after all, and painted it white because, by God, you may be in the flatlands and Capitol Hill is Capitol Hill, but symbolically, Teddy wants to make the presidency first among equals, which means first, and everybody else is unequal. Colorado is pushing back, saying this chief executive notion that you are, in fact, interfering in, as they understood it, Colorado's rights is an argument that is still in play extensively in parts of the West, as is this one, which is adorable. It's Gifford Pinchot as the Czar. We hate Russians, apparently, every generation of us. Whether it's Tsar, Commissar, or Putin, doesn't matter. Don't like them. But there are 2 other figures in here that are even more important. The forest rangers behind him, the Cossacks that roam the Great Plains, the great steppes of America, are holding what in their hand? Whips. Where do whips matter in American history? A mere 40, 50 years earlier? Slavery. What's the East doing to the West? It's enslaving it. And how do we know? Look at the foreground. Settlers, miners, irrigationists, stockmen are down on one knee. They're deferring to this new executive power that is sweeping in off of the plains into Colorado, into Utah, you name it. They are restive. Pinchot loved this cartoon. It's still in his house in Milford, Pennsylvania, prominently placed up on a wall, as it was when he was there, as a reminder and also a kind of joy. They really hate me. How cool is that? There is a certain joy in being disliked when you have power, I suppose. But he did understand the power of democracy to push back against what you thought was good and maybe was complicated, more complicated than you knew. This is how he would like to think of himself. Soft hat, not cape. No ermine cape, no Cossack Rangers. And it's at this event in 1907 that he demonstrates his real value to the Roosevelt administration. Because Roosevelt used him as a lightning rod. You go out there, let people scream and yell at you, and they're not screaming and yelling at the president. And Pinchot understood his role in that way. His parents understood it also, especially his mother, who warned him, Roosevelt is, in her words, quote, a vampire who will suck your energy and leave you an empty husk at the end of his term. I'm telling you, she's a very powerful woman. She wasn't entirely wrong, because Gifford will, in fact, spend a lot of his energy fighting for Roosevelt, going to places like this where people got up and screamed and yelled at him every time he stood up at a podium to speak about why conservation mattered. What he also did at this event was to let them yell for 20 minutes, according to the newspaper reporters at the time. Scream and yell. If they had guns, he would have been dead 1,000 times over. And then he stepped forward and he said, look, I get it. You don't like the idea of conservation. Let me tell you why you should love it. Because when you log out Colorado, what are you leaving your children? When you mine out the seams, what are you leaving your kids? When you take up the water, suck it up, take it away, and destroy it, if you let thousands of head, millions of head of cattle graze across this state, what's left? Very Marsh arguments he put on the ground and said, look, I get why you don't like this, but that's because you're thinking about your time right now at this place to make the money that you make. Why don't you start thinking about 70 years out and tell me what the advantage that you're doing for those generations to come. They were very savvy about, and it's not just political, they in fact deeply believe that the future had the exact same right that the present had in this time and place. And if we don't act on their behalf, who will? And if we don't, they're going to be a little bit angry with us when the world caves in around us because of our unwillingness to think of them. So, that's all well and good until Teddy leaves office. They have this great personal, close working relationship. You can imagine them now swimming nude in the Potomac. Joyful thought. And also writing policy like crazy and creating these national forests and national parks and wildlife refuges and the like. But Roosevelt's handpicked successor, William Howard Taft, is not quite as enamored of the conservation movement as his predecessor had been, even though he promised Roosevelt that he would be. He wasn't. He and Pinchot butt heads over coal seams in Alaska that become a very dramatic story. Pre-Watergate was the largest expose controversy in Washington ever until Watergate. And it's interesting because, in part, it will lead to this, in which Taft tries to tamp down this debate inside his administration. Pinchot has no interest in that debate being tamped down. Taft doesn't actually offer him the job as the inspector of the polar regions, but you get the idea. We need to get rid of this guy in some fashion, and Pinchot needs to call the question on the Taft administration, and you can tell that this is not going to end happily. And when things don't end happily, it's not the president that pays, at least not initially. It's always going to be the subordinate. And so this third cartoon here of Gifford being booted out of office in 1910 for insubordination because he was insubordinate and Taft should have fired him. In fact, Pinchot told Taft, I'm going to be insubordinate. You're going to have to fire me. Just so you know, this is what I'm going to do. Taft fires him. What I love is what Gifford says, and again, you can't read this, so let me transcribe this for you. As he's flying overhead, the guy on the bottom right says, "What's that, Halley's Comet?" And Uncle Sam said, "No, that's Pinchot leaving." But Pinchot says, "I'm going to speak to Teddy about this." Okay, things get interesting, because where's Teddy Roosevelt in 1910, Darren? Africa. Gift is maybe Halley's Comet. So Gift decides through telegrams to Roosevelt that they will meet up in Italy as Roosevelt comes out, confer about what had happened, and figure out what their next plans are. For those of you who know American political history, in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt will vie for the Republican nomination against his hand-picked successor. Where is it? Here. There's Roosevelt in full garb with guns shooting, trying to dislodge Taft from his seat, meaning the White House. He doesn't succeed there. He bails and moves into what will be called the Bull Moose Party, that is underwritten in good measure by Gifford, Pinchot, and others. Pinchot is his chief speechwriter and is basically helping Roosevelt drive that controversy in 1912, in which there are four major candidates, including Eugene Debs, the socialist. There's Wilson, Taft, and Roosevelt. And I think the only time a sitting president comes in third is in 1912. So the message is, don't mess with Giff, because he made Taft pay for this. Taft is booted out. I mean, okay, he becomes a Supreme Court justice. That's not exactly a bad job. But in truth, he derailed Taft's political career, because Taft did not abide by this very close relationship that he had developed, Pinchot had developed with Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, in writing to peers at the time, made the same critique of Taft, that he didn't understand how to manage this charismatic, energetic, younger guy. And he failed because he didn't figure it out. And Taft lost his office as a consequence of that. So these men have this really interesting relationship that then becomes even more interesting to my mind during that campaign, because Gifford Pinchot meets this woman, Cornelia Bryce. She's a neighbor of Teddy Roosevelt's. Teddy Roosevelt said of her she had the best political mind of any person he ever met. Person, not gendered. Person. And so when they would have dinner parties, the men would go off and smoke and do whatever men do. Cornelia was always invited by Teddy into that room because of that wisdom. And she was one of his campaign workers in 1912, where she met Gifford. They fall in love. He's about a decade older than she is. She's a very savvy soul, and would become a crucial figure at the exact moment when Gifford Pinchot's mother dies. And there's a part in my biography of Gifford in which he doesn't get married until his mother is on his deathbed. That's how powerful his mother was in his life. And then he moves into this extraordinary relationship with another equally powerful woman. It's like he traded mom for Cornelia and never missed a beat. It was like he had this very potent force in his life at all times. But that relationship depended in part on other kinds of things. So, in 1919, Theodore Roosevelt died. Pinchot is crushed. But instead of sort of grieving in a public way, although surely he did at some level, he wrote an essay about Roosevelt for the Journal of Forestry to remind those who succeeded Pinchot and those who would succeed them of Roosevelt's part in forestry, which is the title of the piece. And it's this very personal but very important articulation of what a president can do with an idea, injecting those ideas into policy and turning those policies into the creation not just of the national forest, but giving foresters as a profession, whether they work in industry or they work in government or they work at the state level or at the federal level, giving them a recognition that their work mattered, that it was socially constructed and socially necessary. And when the Society of American Foresters was founded in 1900 in Gifford Pinchot's living room in Washington, D.C., the first speaker at its inaugural meeting was the President of the United States. Not bad to have that as your keynote for your very first chapter meeting when you're launching an organization, is to have Teddy there, to which Pinchot referred in his essay about this, to say, this guy understood us and understood the mission we were on. And that's why we need to remember him. Not that we created national forests, not any of that stuff, but it's almost this affective, this emotional engagement with these ideas that mattered most of all. But as this poster also suggests, Roosevelt's death in 1919 was a pivot point for Pinchot as well. He had run for the Senate position in 1914, shortly after being booted out of office, had lost that, was trying to figure out his way into his next life, which would be politics. Ran in the early 20s, became governor of Pennsylvania, ran on what he called the Roosevelt Square Deal. He basically adopted the progressive era language, attributed it to Teddy Roosevelt, and ran with his mantle. But he did not run with the Republican Party's sanction, because they didn't like Roosevelt at this point, and they certainly didn't like young Gifford Pinchot. They thought they were far too radical. They were far too aggressive in their conceptions of what social welfare initiatives must be. And so Pinchot had to cobble together his own coalition in opposition to his own party to win the primary. And he used Roosevelt as one of the wedges that would allow him to not only defeat the Democrats who controlled Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, which are the two big poles of votes, and then all of the Republican strongholds. So he put together a coalition of the following people: miners, those who worked in the mills, workers that neither party was particularly paying much attention to, women, because they now had the right to vote in 1920, and Cornelia Bryce, as a feminist, is actually, in the years preceding, building up women's clubs throughout the state, because they are calculating that at some point Gifford would run for state office, and if so, up will come the women's vote, and he was a feminist himself, and so therefore there was that. Gifford didn't drink, neither did Teddy, so he went after the prohibitionist vote. Nobody's perfect. So he got the prohibitionist vote, and then he looked at the state and recognized amongst the most marginal peoples and places in Pennsylvania are the northern tier of counties. Every state has some sector that economically is disadvantaged, whose people are marginalized, and nobody thinks about them because there's not a lot of them. And he was a big believer in those small farms. And so he got small farmers, he got urban workers, imagine that coalition, he got feminists, he got all of these prohibitionists, not all of them feminists. And he managed to pull this coalition together that gets him into office in 1922, and that would get him into office again in the 1930s. You couldn't succeed yourself. Both times, he ran with this quote to lead it. Theodore Roosevelt wrote to Gifford Pinchot, "You were the leader among all the men in public office and the aggressive, hard-hitting leader of all the forces that were struggling for conservation." That comes right out of the autobiography that Gifford's mother forced Roosevelt to write. Mom is still around, dead all of these years. Her ghost and her powerful ethos is still animating Gifford Pinchot's life, even though that's not what's said here. That's sort of part of the backstory. And as governor, it's Pinchot who also, because he was so charismatic and so publicly driven and wrote like crazy, like Roosevelt, he is constantly churning out articles, the likes of which utterly transformed the biography I thought I was going to write. I didn't know anything about the 20s and 30s in his career. I knew a lot about the conservation stuff. I didn't know about the stuff that would come. And you're watching this man think through two different sets of problems. In the 1920s, where everything is flush and you don't have a budget that's under control, he got the budget under control. The first time ever in Pennsylvania that it had a balanced budget in its history was under this very gifted administrator's hands. And then he gets into office in the Great Depression, where there's no budget, no money, and you have to make stuff up. And so part of what he made up, which was preceding the New Deal, was to think about those workers who had voted for him, what they need. And he came up with an idea that he called human conservation, sort of a push beyond Roosevelt at this point, in which he said, if we're not thinking about workers and their wages, we're not progressive. If we're not thinking about workers and the communities in which they live, the neighborhoods that they occupy, we're not being good conservationists. If we think about those rural farmlands that have been battered in this economy and we can't figure out how to get their food to the market, then we're not doing our job. So one of the things he did in the 1930s is he built roads. They're still called today Pinchot roads, linking all of these farm-to-market towns all over the northern tier, but also all over the state, because the counties had no money, the state didn't have much, and he, sorry for all the teachers in the room, this part's a little hard to swallow, he went after the teachers' retirement monies, plucked that money out, and put people to work. Teachers didn't like him terribly much, but the unemployed loved him because, in fact, it meant that he could create military-like camps all over the state, again, before the CCC, and put people to work building roads, regenerating landscapes, and the like. Franklin Roosevelt is governor of New York, across the river, watching what Gifford Pinchot is doing as governor of Pennsylvania. Asked Pinchot for a white paper, telling him what to do with this idea and how to take it national. The Civilian Conservation Corps owes its origin, in fact, to Teddy Roosevelt's right-hand man, who is now, for his second term, governor of Pennsylvania. That's the way in which these ideas flow across the land and evolve across time. And I think part of what we need to be thinking about as we think about these two men is those kinds of legacies that they left behind, one of which is physical. That map is the map of all of the national forest, only some of which Teddy had his hand in. All of the ones to the east and the Middle West, those all came later. Those up here and the grasslands up here came later. But the ideas emerging out of the 1880s that would sort of find their first flowering under the Teddy Roosevelt administration has created a very different map in the United States in terms of conservation of natural resources and a very different sort of political calculation. But the other, and I want to end on this, is an idea that Pinchot and Roosevelt both talked about. Pinchot talked about it in a book he wrote after he got fired for insubordination. And in effect, it's not just these ideas of conservation that matter, it's the kind of citizenry we are that matters more than anything. As he says here, it's a greater thing to be a good citizen than a Democrat or a Republican. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you. Wow. A tremendous lecture. Thank you. We're just having such a great symposium here. We're going to do some questions. I know you have some. I just want to get started just quickly by saying, all right, so Taft becomes president. Taft is a disappointment. Pinchot is insubordinate. He writes to the Senate. He's not allowed to do that. And he even warns Taft that he's going to do it. Why did he do it? Why, we're having this debate now. How long do you hang in there with the president who's disappointing you and so on?
I get to talk about that? You just gave me an opening.
But how long do you hang in there? Why didn't you stay and fight the good fight?
Yeah, so this is a really important question, and I do a lot of work with the U.S. Forest Service today on middle and senior leadership programs, and so I go in to do things like this in a way to say, look, this is your past, and here's where leadership works and sometimes doesn't, and that's exactly one of the questions I leave with them, which is, when do you say no? So I always quote, sorry for those online, you get to hear this though, from E.E. Cummings. A wonderful World War I poem in which Olaf, who's a conscientious objector, says, there is some shit I will not eat. There is some I will, right? Because you have to be able to figure out which is which, right? So there were other disappointments at different points where he did not say, this is it. And I think the decision is largely framed around he did not think that Taft would change, and that therefore the thing for him to do was not to go out quietly, but to make an explosion, not because he thought Roosevelt would run again, but because he wanted to call the question, and warn Taft in every way possible that this was coming. Taft pleaded with him not to do it. He did not want to fire him because Taft's no fool. He knows what the blowback is going to be. So I would say, as I tell the forest rangers who I work with, I said, look, this was a dramatic, kind of exciting moment. Gifford's mother goes, hooray, when I mean, literally, that's what she said, in her diary, when she learned that her son had been fired. So mom's supportive. You know, it's always important to have a supportive parent. But the agency, as an agency, gets clobbered as a consequence of this. And that's the piece that's much harder to work through. The budget got slashed, the personnel got fired. I mean, they just got leveled because Congress was sick of Pinchot and they were happy to see him go, and then they just took off after the agency. So there are consequences to saying no, and he suffered from them, as did his peers.
I want to follow that up, but first, quickly, we're going to run out of time, but how big a factor was Pinchot? He goes over to Italy. That's not like flying there today. That's a 6 or 7 or 8 day journey. Yeah. He had that meeting with Roosevelt. He said that a day-long meeting. He said some of the best conversations we ever had. How big a factor was the Pinchot firing and apostasy in TR deciding to run?
I think it mattered every time Gifford talked about it, right? I mean, it depends on who he's listening to, right, that would shape the way he did it. But I think Roosevelt recognized, even though he thought Pinchot had in some ways done wrong and that Taft clearly hadn't figured out how to manage this guy, that Taft was drifting into sort of a more corporate-dominated Republican Party, or the party was drifting with Taft in that direction, and that was not the direction either Roosevelt or his closest advisors wanted to go. So I think that meeting in Italy was crucial in sort of laying out what's the boundary lines here? Where would we push and where would we not push? And you've got to do that to figure out whether you actually want to run or don't want to run, and what is it going to cost you and how are you going to do it. But that Pinchot became his speechwriter tells us something also, that he could think like Roosevelt because he'd been around him. Think for him, think with him, write the words that he would speak. But Roosevelt was always very extemporaneous and would sort of go beyond some of that stuff. But I think that helps us also understand these guys knew each other intimately. And I think that's also part of the calculation.
But I'm guessing you're going to say that if Pinchot had stayed in his post and Taft had been still a disappointment to TR probably still runs against Taft. In other words, it's a factor, but it's not the only factor.
I know it's not the only factor.
By far.
By far.
Last question, hard question is, I know that historians hate this question, but great man, great ideas. If McKinley had lived, and Pinchot had become a real estate broker in Manhattan, how different does that map look?
Ooh. Wow. I think the map was already in play, that the presidents had the power already to do what McKinley also did. Had he lived, he would have added more acreage to this forest. I don't think it would have blown up quite as fast, because one of the things that Taft didn't like about Teddy Roosevelt is that he thought Teddy Roosevelt would look at sort of the legal landscape and go, this is what it says I can do. It doesn't say what I can't do. So I'm going to do the things that nobody has never said anything about. So for example, the first bird refuge, he asked the lawyers in the federal government, does it say I can't do this? They said, well, no, it doesn't say you can't, but it also doesn't say you can. He says, so then I do. That's the power of presidencies, right? You would just move forward, and that's a thing that Taft would not have done. He's a constitutional lawyer, after all.
So it's a question of scale, not...
Scale. Yeah, no, I think it's a question of scale.
Okay.
Yeah.
Questions? Here's one.
Yeah.
Elder Leopold able to influence Roosevelt or Pinchot?
Aldo Leopold.
Aldo Leopold was actually much younger than them.
Comes later.
He comes later. Although I will say that he went to the Yale Forest School that Gifford Pinchot underwrote and created at Yale. He got his first hands-on forest work on the Pinchot estate in Pennsylvania because they moved a summer camp up there. So in his early career, and he also worked for the Forest Service, Leopold was, as he would describe himself, a kind of acolyte to this larger man. In time, Leopold obviously moves in a different direction environmentally. But even so, in what I think is one of the most famous essays of Leopold that I use in my classes all the time is a piece called Axe in Hand. And he says a conservationist inscribes himself on the land with the tool, that you manage landscapes. And that's right out of his education in the Yale Forest School.
This one.
Taft wasn't without some sort of very positive standing.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Because one of the things he was arguing was that Roosevelt, as wonderful as he was, had abused executive power.
Right.
And he wanted these policies to arise from legislation.
Yes.
In a very legalistic way.
Very
he
so.
went on to become a judge.
Yeah.
And say that over and over again.
Yes.
So, I mean, where does that leave it? Is that simply a conservative argument that's a hedge, or does it have a certain kind of
Was Taft right?
power? Is
Yeah.
Taft right to want to impose a new standard of how you use executive power?
I think the fun thing about questions like that is depends on who. Taft thought he was right. Roosevelt knew he was right. There's a difference, and I think their training is different in that regard, right? That Roosevelt, as a scientist, is an experimenter. To go to sort of Darren's comments, that you push and you err and you move and you act. The man in the arena speech, which we've been hearing quoted a lot, is in fact about the trial and error of a politician, which is exactly the trial and error of a scientist.
Let's do one more. Yes.
About the letter from Pinchot's mother to Colonel.
Yes.
Pinchot's letter to the mother.
Available either to the presidential library or to.
I don't know if
That
you
letter.
guys have that
Sharon, do you know
letter.
anything about this? We haven't. I don't think we've processed that letter.
But I
yet.
have a really good book you could buy that it's in there.
It's a great segue. But before we do the book signing, we'll take a 15-minute break. But you haven't told the story of the Midnight Forest, so you quickly tell that.
Right. So one of the ways to think about how these guys, and this actually goes to your question about legality versus whatever, right? The sort of legislative process. I got to go back. Sorry. So it's the lecture in reverse. Just let it run through your heads. Oh, I missed it. Sorry. There we go. One of the ways you go from the numbers in 1898 to the numbers in 1907 is something called the Midnight Forests. The West was not happy by that map in 1898, and they were really unhappy when Roosevelt starts redesignating public lands at a fairly rapid fashion. And they put a rider, and I can't remember, it must have been a budgetary appropriation.
It was an ag bill.
It was an ag bill, in which it said the president could only do this through consultation with Congress. Couldn't do it on his own. Even though the 1891 Act had said he could do it on his own, they're saying, okay, hold on. We want to have a play in here. And so there was a deadline for the veto. Well, you know what a deadline looks like when there are days in front of it. You can act or not act. Roosevelt and Pinchot looked at those 8 days, 10 days, I can't remember.
10,
yeah. And went, okay. So until that day comes, we can do what we've always been doing. So Pinchot gets on telegraph and telephone, and the Forest Service is the first federal agency that used both forms of communication rigorously. Every district office is tapped into the White House, or tapped into the Washington office. They could get out, and so they flashed out news like, what do you want? You've got the federal lands. What lands can we get that are forested? They don't want ag land, because that's foolish. That could be turned into agriculture. The wires came back in with the coordinates, the latitude and longitude, and there's other guys in that upstairs office in the Atlantic building with big maps on the floor, sort of doing stuff like this, right? We're taking this. And then they're typing up the coordinates. Pinchot is walking them by hand with gun inside over to the White House. Roosevelt signs the documents, puts them in a safe, and then at the last moment, before he signs the ag bill, he pulls these out, drops them on the table, and says, I'm signing this, but these are already signed. And there was I can't remember the number of acres that went into
16 million.
16 million acres, I think, became national forest as a consequence of that. And you can only imagine how the legislature felt about that. But again, it's Roosevelt saying,
Hey.
you gave me 10 days. What did you think I was going to do? Cave? I mean, this is a guy in the arena, right? If you're going to get bloodied in the arena, that means everybody gets bloodied. And not just the president. You can beat me up, but trust me, I've already pinned Pinchot. I can mess with you guys. And so there are those stories that are not apocryphal. They are quite real. It's very clear that this happened. But they gain a kind of apocryphal way in which we think about a chief executive and what he, and maybe someday she, can do.
Professor Char Miller.
Thank you.
Sharon.